I still remember the sound of the chair scraping the floor when she stood up. We were sitting in her aunt's living room, the kind that smells like strong tea and old curtains. Her mother was near the window. Her cousin was scrolling on her phone, and two of her friends were pretending not to listen. I had just asked a simple question. I asked what would happen to the deposits since the wedding was officially canceled. She didn't answer right away. She sighed first, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then she said, "Why are you acting like this is my problem?" The room went quiet in that specific way where everyone hears everything. I felt my face heat up, but I didn't move. She kept going. "You paid for it because you wanted to. Don't start counting money now. It's embarrassing." Her mother nodded slightly, like that settled it. One of her friends smirked and looked at me, then quickly looked away. No one defended me. No one even asked how much I had paid. $22,000. I didn't say the number out loud. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it would have made it real. Or maybe because I already knew how it would sound coming out of my mouth in that room, like a complaint, like weakness. She grabbed her bag and said she was done talking about it. As she walked toward the door, she added, "We're not doing this today. Not we're not doing this right now. Not let's talk later. Just we're not doing this." I remember noticing a crack in the wall behind her, running from the light switch down toward the floor. I focused on it longer than I should have. It felt safer than looking at anyone's face. Her aunt cleared her throat. Someone turned the TV volume up. Life continued, just not for me. I stood up, said nothing, and walked out. No argument, no raised voice, no last stand. I sat in my car for a long time before turning the key. My hands were shaking, but my face was calm. I already knew reacting would only make it worse. So I stayed quiet. That was the moment I learned how disposable I really was. When people ask how things got like that, I always struggle to explain it without sounding stupid. Because from the outside, it didn't look unbalanced. We were engaged. We lived together. We made plans like everyone else. But inside the relationship, the roles were already set. I was the one who adjusted. She was the one who decided. Her name was Maribel. And she had a way of speaking that made everything sound final. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just certain. If she wanted something, it wasn't framed as a request. It was framed as the obvious next step, and if I hesitated, that hesitation became the problem. I worked in logistics for a mid-sized import company. Long hours, predictable pay, nothing flashy. She liked to tell people she was between opportunities, which sounded better than saying she was freelancing on and off and relying on me most months. No one ever questioned it. When wedding planning started, it became very clear whose wedding it was. She'd say things like, "I've dreamed about this since I was a kid," or "This is something I'll remember for the rest of my life." And every time she said that, it felt like there was no room left for my opinion. If I asked about cost, she'd smile and say, "We'll figure it out. You always do." Her mother, Lucinda, reinforced it without ever saying it directly. She'd praise Maribel's taste, her vision, how lucky I was to be marrying someone who knew what she wanted. When money came up, Lucinda would glance at me and say, "Well, he's practical. He'll handle it." At tastings or venue tours, people talked to her. Vendors looked at her when discussing upgrades, options, add-ons. When they mentioned prices, their eyes drifted to me automatically, like it was understood. I noticed how praise moved in one direction. If Maribel chose a venue, she was decisive. If I hesitated at the price, I was anxious. If she changed her mind, it was refinement. If I asked for time, it was resistance. There were people around us who saw it and stayed quiet. Her cousin Elena would sometimes raise her eyebrows at me when Maribel walked away, like she knew something but wasn't going to say it. Her friend Tasha joked once that I was the budget department. Everyone laughed. I did too. I told myself that this was normal. That weddings were stressful. That once things settled, balance would come back. But looking back, the hierarchy was already there. She spoke. I accommodated. She decided. I funded. She was celebrated. I was useful. And the worst part is, I didn't fight it. Not because I agreed with it, but because keeping the peace felt easier than questioning my place in her world. There were nights when I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations I hadn't finished. Things I almost said. Questions I swallowed. It wasn't that I didn't notice what was happening. I noticed it early. I just convinced myself it was temporary. I'd tell myself that relationships have phases, that sometimes one person carries more weight, that once the wedding passed, things would even out. I repeated that thought so often it started to sound like truth. The money bothered me more than I admitted. Not because I didn't have it, but because of how easily it left my hands. Deposits here, upgrades there, sudden changes that cost thousands without discussion. Every time I hesitated, I felt like I was being tested, like saying no would expose something ugly about me. I didn't want to be that guy. The one who puts a price tag on love. The one who ruins excitement by asking for spreadsheets. So I stayed quiet and worked harder instead. I picked up extra shifts. I took on weekend contracts that left me exhausted by Monday. I stopped upgrading my own car, stopped traveling to see friends, stopped buying anything that wasn't necessary. When she asked how work was going, I'd say fine and change the subject. Part of me knew I was compensating. I just didn't know how else to feel secure. There were moments when doubt crept in unexpectedly. Standing in line at the bank, opening another email marked final payment. Watching her scroll through photos of dresses that cost more than my first year's rent. Each time, something in my chest tightened, then loosened when I told myself it would all be worth it. I never talked to anyone about it. Not my coworkers, not my family. Saying it out loud would have made it sound worse. So I kept everything internal, managed it quietly, like a problem that could be solved with enough effort. What I didn't realize then was that effort was the only thing being asked of me. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't even angry yet. I was just trying to survive a situation that felt slightly off, hoping it would correct itself if I stayed patient long enough. But patience can look a lot like permission when it goes unchecked. By the time I started keeping records of payments and emails, it wasn't because I expected betrayal. It was because something in me wanted proof that I hadn't imagined the imbalance. That if I ever needed to explain myself, I could. I didn't know who I'd be explaining it to. I just knew I needed to understand it for myself. Once the big decisions were locked in, the smaller ones started piling up. The kind that don't sound serious when you describe them individually, but leave you drained when you live through them. It happened at dinners, mostly. With friends. With family. With people who felt entitled to comment because there was a wedding coming. Someone would ask about the venue, and Maribel would answer without looking at me. She'd describe it in detail, then add, he was nervous about the price at first, but I convinced him. It always got a laugh. I smiled when they laughed. I didn't correct her. At one dinner, her friend Tasha asked how we were splitting costs. Before I could speak, Maribel waved her hand and said, "Oh, he's handling it." I'd go crazy dealing with numbers. Tasha nodded like that made sense. No one asked if I was okay with it. Another time, her uncle joked that I should be grateful she wasn't asking for a destination wedding. Some guys really get taken to the cleaners, he said, clinking his glass against mine. I forced a laugh. Maribel squeezed my knee under the table, not as comfort but as a signal to play along. The comments kept coming, always wrapped in humor or concern. You look tired. Working too much? You should let her enjoy this. Each one was small. None of them were worth starting a fight over. That's what I told myself. Even vendors joined in without meaning to. A decorator asked if we wanted a more elaborate setup and looked straight at me when she mentioned the price. Before I could respond, Maribel said, "He'll make it work." The decorator smiled and wrote it down. I noticed how my role had become predictable. I was the pause in conversations, the person everyone glanced at before moving forward. My opinion wasn't required, only my agreement. At home, it showed up in quieter ways. She'd come back from a meeting and tell me what we decided, using "we" loosely. If I questioned something, she'd accuse me of adding stress. "Why are you doing this now?" she'd ask. I'd back off immediately. There was one night when I tried to explain how overwhelmed I felt. I didn't mention money. I just said I was tired. She listened for a minute, then said, "You know this is hard for me too, right?" The conversation ended there. After that, I stopped trying. I started speaking less at gatherings. When people joked, I let it pass. When decisions were announced, I nodded. I learned how to disappear while still being present. It was easier than being labeled difficult. The strange part is that no one ever crossed a single obvious line. No shouting, no insults you could point to, just a steady pattern of being talked over, assumed, and reduced to a function. Looking back, I can see how each moment trained me, how each small dismissal made the next one easier. By the time anything truly serious happened, everyone, including me, was already used to me absorbing it quietly. I wasn't angry yet. I was just tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. What no one saw during that time was how much of my life had quietly narrowed. My world became smaller on purpose. Work, home, and whatever corner of the night I could steal for myself after she fell asleep. I stopped explaining where I was going or why I was tired. It was easier to let people assume I was just committed, just grinding, just doing what men do before a wedding. I started tracking everything, not obsessively, not in a dramatic way, just clean records, payments, dates, confirmations. I told myself it was for organization, but deep down I think I needed proof that I wasn't imagining how much I was giving. I learned to live on very little. Lunches became leftovers. Weekends became recovery time instead of rest. I turned down invitations because they cost money, and when people asked why I'd been distant, I blamed work. That explanation always ended the conversation. At night, I taught myself things I never talked about: how contracts actually work, how deposits are structured, what non-refundable really means and when it doesn't apply. I read quietly, methodically, without telling myself a story about where it might lead. There was no sense of momentum, no feeling of progress, just repetition and discipline. Wake up, work, pay, save what I could, learn a little more. Repeat. Maribel noticed changes, but not in the way I expected. She said I seemed distracted, less enthusiastic. She asked if I was getting cold feet. I said no, because explaining the truth felt heavier than lying. The loneliness surprised me. Not the absence of people, but the absence of being seen. I was surrounded by plans, conversations, and expectations, yet completely alone with my concerns. There was no one I could vent to without sounding petty or paranoid. Some nights I sat in my car after work, not because I needed time to decompress, but because it was the only place that felt quiet. No decisions, no assumptions, just me and the dashboard lights humming softly. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel strategic. I felt cornered in a polite, socially acceptable way, like someone slowly tightening a rope while smiling. And still, I didn't confront her. Not because I lacked courage, but because I was starting to understand something important. Emotional conversations with someone who controls the narrative rarely change anything. They just give the other person more material. So I stayed disciplined instead, quietly prepared, not for revenge, not for a dramatic exit, just for the possibility that one day I'd need to stand on something solid. At the time, I didn't know how close that day was. The cancellation didn't come with a conversation. It came with a message. I was at work, sitting in a meeting I barely remember, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't check it right away. I waited until the meeting ended, until everyone filed out and the room went quiet. Then I looked. It was from Maribel. 3 sentences. No greeting. She said she'd been thinking. She said the wedding didn't feel right anymore. She said she'd already informed the venue and a few vendors. No apology. No explanation that made sense. Just a statement of fact. I called her immediately. She didn't pick up. I tried again, straight to voicemail. By the time she finally answered, hours later, she sounded calm, almost relieved. "This isn't working," she said. "Dragging it out won't help." I asked about the money. Not aggressively, just asked. She paused, then said most of it was already spent or locked in. Non-refundable. She said it like she was reading off a policy, not talking about my savings. When I told her I needed details, she got defensive. Asked why I was making this about money. Said she was going through something emotional, and I was focused on the wrong thing. That was the moment something shifted, because it wasn't just that the wedding was over. It was that she had made decisions that affected my finances without involving me at all. Canceled contracts. Communicated on my behalf. Closed doors I was still paying for. Over the next few days, pieces came together slowly. I learned that some vendors hadn't been paid in full. Others had. One had issued a partial credit that I'd never been told about. The money hadn't come back to me. When I asked where it went, she avoided the question. Changed the subject. Claimed she'd covered emotional labor and planning costs. Said she deserved something after everything. That's when I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I stopped asking her to understand. I started documenting. I requested copies of contracts. I pulled bank statements. I made calls under the excuse of closure. Each conversation revealed another quiet decision made without me. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't stress. This was control. The line wasn't crossed loudly. There was no explosion, just a calm refusal to return money she had never earned and never contributed. And when I finally said, clearly, that I expected the funds accounted for, she laughed. Not cruelly, just dismissively. "You're not getting it back," she said. "You should let it go." That was the first time she spoke to me like I was irrelevant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anything. I thanked her for being honest and ended the call. From that moment on, I treated the situation like what it was. Not a breakup, not heartbreak, but a financial dispute with someone who no longer had access to my emotions. Once the calls stopped and the paperwork was organized, there was nothing left to distract me. No planning. No arguments. No illusion that things might still turn around. That's when it hit. Not all at once. In waves. I started questioning my own judgment in ways I never had before. Not just the relationship, but myself. How I let things slide. How easily I confused patience with maturity. How long I stayed quiet because it felt safer than being difficult. I replayed moments I'd ignored. The jokes. The dismissals. The way decisions were always presented as already made. I wondered whether I'd been naive or simply convenient. The financial reality sank in slowly. $22,000 isn't just a number. It's time. It's weekends. It's months of restraint. It's the accumulation of small sacrifices that don't show up on a bank statement. Some mornings I sat at the edge of the bed longer than usual, staring at the floor, trying to gather enough momentum to stand up. Work felt heavier. Conversations felt hollow. People asked how I was doing, and I gave them answers that ended the discussion. I didn't feel dramatic sadness. I felt dull. Flat, like someone had taken something from me that I hadn't realized was keeping me upright. The moment that shifted things didn't come from a friend or family member. It came from a woman I barely knew. I was on the phone with a vendor, following up on one last invoice. She'd been polite but distant until she pulled up the file. Then, her tone changed. She paused, apologized, and said, "I'm sorry. It looks like all payments came from you. You should have been consulted before any cancellations. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't validation in a dramatic sense. It was just a neutral acknowledgement of reality. But it mattered. Because for weeks, I'd been treated like I was overreacting. Like money was secondary. Like my concerns were inconvenient. Hearing someone state plainly that I should have had a say grounded me in a way I didn't expect. I ended the call and sat there quietly. Nothing was fixed. The money wasn't back. The situation hadn't improved, but for the first time since the cancellation, I stopped blaming myself entirely. I realized that what happened wasn't just about bad judgment. It was about someone taking advantage of silence. Once I stopped trying to make sense of her behavior emotionally, things became clearer. Not easier, but clearer. I didn't confront her again. I didn't demand explanations or apologies. I treated the situation the way I would have treated a professional dispute, even though it felt anything but professional. I organized everything into folders: contracts, emails, payment confirmations, cancellation notices. I wrote timelines without commentary. Dates, amounts, who authorized what. No assumptions, no accusations. When I reached out, I kept my messages short, neutral, focused. I stopped asking why and started asking for documentation. Some vendors responded quickly. Others hesitated, then complied when they realized I wasn't emotional, just thorough. Maribel noticed the shift. She texted asking why I was being distant. I didn't answer. A few days later, she accused me of being cold. I let that sit too. I consulted someone who deals with these situations for a living. I didn't dramatize it. I laid out the facts and asked what was realistic, what was enforceable, what wasn't worth chasing. The advice wasn't glamorous. No promises, just options and limits. It grounded me. From that point on, every move I made had a purpose. Not to hurt her. Not to embarrass her. Just to protect myself and recover what I could without burning everything down. I stopped framing things as personal. That was the hardest part, letting go of the need to be understood. Letting go of the hope that she'd suddenly acknowledge what she'd done. Boundaries replaced conversations, procedures replaced feelings. When she finally called, I didn't answer. I waited until she texted something concrete. A question, a request. That told me more than anything else could. I learned quickly that calm unsettles people who expect emotion. The less I reacted, the more measured my position became. I wasn't negotiating from pain anymore. I was operating from structure. I also accepted that I might not get everything back. That was part of staying grounded. I prepared myself for partial recovery, not vindication. What surprised me was how much lighter I felt once I stopped hoping for fairness from her. Once I stopped expecting decency as a given and started treating it as optional. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic turning point. I was simply building a framework where her choices no longer dictated my response. And for the first time since everything unraveled, I felt in control of something again. She didn't ask to meet right away. First came the indirect messages. Short questions, vague concerns. Then a longer text about needing to clear the air. I didn't respond until she was specific. When she finally asked if we could talk about next steps, I agreed. I chose the place. A quiet cafe near my office, neutral and public, where conversations stayed measured by default. She arrived late. Not dramatically, just enough to reassert an old habit. I was already seated, coffee untouched. When she sat down, she smiled like we were catching up, not negotiating the aftermath of a financial mess. She started talking immediately about stress, about how hard the last few weeks had been for her, about how she felt misunderstood. I listened without interrupting. I didn't nod. I didn't react. Eventually, she stopped and waited for me to fill the silence. I asked one question: whether she had documentation for how the remaining funds were used. She blinked, then frowned, said it wasn't that simple. That money had gone toward planning, emotional labor, time. I didn't argue. I slid a printed summary across the table. Just numbers. No commentary. She flipped through it slowly. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. This wasn't a conversation she could steer emotionally. This was something else. She asked what I wanted. I told her what I expected. A clear accounting. Reimbursement where possible. Cooperation with vendors. Nothing more, nothing less. She tried to negotiate through familiarity. Reminded me of what we'd shared. Said she never meant to hurt me. I let the words pass without reacting. When she realized I wasn't engaging on that level, her tone shifted. Sharper. More defensive. She accused me of being calculating, of treating her like a stranger. I told her calmly that I was treating the situation according to how it stood now, not how it used to be. There was a long pause. People around us talked and laughed. Cups clinked. Life continued. She asked if this was a threat. I said no. I said it was a boundary. That's when it became clear who needed the meeting more. She wasn't here to reconcile. She was here to regain footing, to understand what I might do next. I stood up before she did, told her she could follow up in writing, paid for my coffee and left. For the first time in our entire relationship, the conversation ended on my terms. I didn't hear from her for a few days after that meeting. When she finally reached out, it wasn't emotional. It was careful. Her message was structured, almost formal. She attached a document listing expenses, some receipts, some explanations, gaps where clarity should have been. I didn't respond immediately. I reviewed everything twice before saying anything at all. I replied with specific questions. No commentary, no accusations, just requests for clarification where numbers didn't align. I pointed out discrepancies calmly, like I would in any other professional exchange. She pushed back at first, claimed some costs couldn't be verified, said certain payments were justified by time and stress. I acknowledged the message without agreeing. Then I sent her my conditions. They weren't dramatic. They weren't threatening. They were simply structured. Funds that could be recovered would be returned. Vendors would be contacted jointly for remaining credits. Anything unaccounted for would be treated as unresolved. I made it clear that cooperation would keep things contained. Lack of it would force me to escalate. I didn't say how. I didn't need to. There was no immediate response. Then a short message came through hours later. She said she needed time. When she finally agreed, it wasn't enthusiastic. It was resigned. The tone of someone realizing leverage had shifted. Over the next few weeks, money returned in pieces. Not all of it. Enough to matter. Enough to confirm that resistance had never been about impossibility, only comfort. We didn't speak beyond what was necessary. Every interaction stayed within the framework I'd set. She stopped trying to appeal to history. I stopped acknowledging anything outside the process. What struck me was how little drama there was once emotion was removed. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just outcomes. The consequences weren't humiliating. They weren't public. They didn't ruin her life. They simply corrected an imbalance that should never have existed. By the time the last transfer cleared, there was nothing left to discuss. The situation was closed. Cleanly. Quietly. The shift didn't announce itself. It showed up in small pauses and half-finished sentences. People who used to speak freely around me became more careful. Invitations changed tone. Conversations slowed when I entered the room. No one asked directly what had happened, but everyone seemed to know that the version they'd been given wasn't complete. Her mother stopped texting me entirely. Not abruptly, just gradually. Messages that once ended with questions now ended with statements. Eventually, they stopped altogether. A few mutual friends reached out under neutral excuses, checking in, asking how work was going, testing the temperature. When I kept my answers factual and short, the conversations didn't go much further. At one gathering I almost didn't attend, someone mentioned the canceled wedding casually, then stopped mid-sentence when they noticed my reaction, or lack of one. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was cautious. I realized then that narratives don't collapse loudly. They erode. People started filling in gaps on their own. They noticed that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't venting, that I wasn't trying to control the story. That restraint unsettled them more than outrage would have. Someone mentioned offhandedly that planning must have been expensive. Another replied that deposits are tricky. No one looked at me when they said it, but the implication hung there. Maribel didn't correct anything. She didn't defend herself or explain. She withdrew instead. Showed up less. Spoke less. The confidence she once carried into rooms softened into something guarded. There was no apology passed through intermediaries. No acknowledgement disguised as concern. Just distance. And that distance told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't vindicated. I wasn't publicly validated. But I was no longer invisible. The roles people had quietly assigned began to loosen. I wasn't the guy who paid. I was just someone who didn't overreact, didn't implode, and didn't disappear. In a strange way, that changed how people spoke to me. Slower, more measured, with less assumption. Nothing was resolved socially. Nothing needed to be. The truth didn't need a spokesperson. It was doing fine on its own. There wasn't a moment where everything suddenly felt resolved. No deep breath where the weight lifted all at once. Closure didn't arrive like that. It came quietly, in pieces. The first was noticing that I no longer checked my phone expecting a message from her, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left that required my attention. No loose ends, no unfinished business disguised as emotion. I moved apartments a few months later. Not far, just enough to reset routines. I didn't take much with me. Furniture, clothes, documents. The rest didn't feel worth carrying. People asked if I'd learned anything from the experience. I never knew how to answer that without oversimplifying it. I didn't learn how to avoid pain. I didn't learn how to spot every red flag in advance. What I learned was subtler. I learned how easily silence can be mistaken for consent, how restraint can turn into expectation if it's never challenged, and how dangerous it is to tie your value to how useful you are to someone else's vision. I didn't become bitter. I didn't swear off relationships. I didn't walk away thinking I'd been unlucky. I walked away understanding where I stopped showing up for myself. The money mattered, but it wasn't the hardest thing to lose. What hurt more was realizing how long I'd allowed myself to be reduced to a role instead of a partner. That won't happen again. Not because I'll be louder, not because I'll be colder, but because I'll be clearer, earlier. Sometimes people ask if I ever hear from her. I don't. And I don't wonder what she tells people now. Some stories don't need correcting. They end when you stop participating. And that's exactly what I did.